Benvenute e benvenuti a questo festival del classico davvero speciale, unico e forse anche irripetibile. Il festival durerà dal 29 novembre al 4 dicembre e sarà un festival particolare perché abbiamo superato distanze incolmabili con questa serie di incontri che vedrete, che ascolterete anche tutti voi a distanza. Abbiamo cercato di trasformare le limitazioni di questo confinamento globale in un'opportunità per raggiungere delle voci internazionali che non avremmo mai nemmeno osato provare ad invitare sul posto, e questo significa appunto cogliere l'opportunità dalle difficoltà. Sarà un festival diverso dagli altri perché sarà tutto sulle piattaforme digitali e si potrà godere seduti comodamente a casa. Sarà un festival diverso dagli altri perché questa distanza diventerà una vera e propria autentica vicinanza e ascolto di grandi parole da parte di tutto il mondo, mettiamola così. Vi ricordo che è un momento importante di questo festival, in cui voci femminili e maschili, straniere e italiane si alterneranno, sarà la notte bianca degli eroi, il 28 novembre a partire dalle 22:30, condotta da Neri Marco Re e con grandi ospiti che vanno da Melania Mazzucco a Chiara Valerio, Matteo Nucci, Andrea Marcolongo, Roberto Vecchioni, tutti sul filo di questo racconto eroico che non passa mai di moda. Il festival stesso vedrà poi grandi nomi, tra cui Daniel Mendelssohn, scrittore americano, Martha Nussbaum, Luciano Canfora, Eva Cantarella, Massimo Cacciari e tanti altri. Sarà un programma davvero ricco e sorprendente. Questo programma si è potuto realizzare grazie anche alla collaborazione di tante istituzioni e tante persone, a incominciare da Luciano Canfora, che è l'anima di questa iniziativa, presidente onorario del festival, e Ugo Cardinale, che è il curatore. Grazie naturalmente a tutti gli autori che contribuiscono a questa rassegna, che si alterneranno sulle nostre piattaforme. Il Festival del Classico è realizzato con il sostegno della Regione Piemonte e della Fondazione Cassa di Risparmio di Torino e con il patrocinio della città di Torino. Ringrazio in modo particolare la Vazza, main partner della nostra fondazione, che ci accompagnerà lungo la Notte degli Eroi. Un ringraziamento particolare non può non andare alle scuole e agli studenti che stanno vivendo in un periodo davvero difficile e che pur tuttavia hanno lavorato con noi alla realizzazione di questo festival a Torino, in Piemonte e nel resto d'Italia, in particolare il Liceo Vivona di Roma. Grazie anche all'Ufficio Scolastico Regionale del Piemonte per le dispute, alla Rete del Piemonte Dibattito e Cittadinanza. Questa edizione è molto speciale per tante ragioni di cui vi accorgerete strada facendo, ma è molto speciale anche perché abbiamo avviato una collaborazione con il Ministero degli Affari Esteri per la prima volta quest'anno, ed il Ministero è al nostro fianco per la promozione di questi incontri, di questo festival, con il coinvolgimento delle scuole italiane all'estero e degli istituti italiani di cultura nel mondo. Quindi ancora una volta i confini che si spezzano e le distanze che vengono azzerate da questo incontro digitale, questo lungo e appassionante incontro digitale che sarà il Festival del Classico. Sta per prendere la parola un grandissimo scrittore che è Aleph Bet Yehoshua, al quale abbiamo affidato una anteprima non meno speciale di questo festival. Quando vi dico allargare i confini, ebbene, lo si intende nel modo più ampio possibile, i confini che si spezzano attraverso il digitale, ma anche i confini della nostra idea di classico. Se classico è ciò che ha sempre qualche cosa da dire, che sia un libro, un'opera d'arte, un'idea, ebbene è importante che quando si parla di classico si estenda questa idea di ciò che è oggetto di imitazione, di ciò che ci dice ancora e sempre qualche cosa, anche verso universi culturali e storici che normalmente non vengono contestualizzati nella nostra idea di classico, e per questo allargamento di orizzonti si intende naturalmente quella tradizione biblica da cui tanto della nostra civiltà parte, e anche, ed è quello sul quale rifletterà lo scrittore Aleph Yehoshua, riflessione sul concetto di identità ebraica come paradigma di incontro fra mito e realtà. Lui ci parlerà, vi parlerà di questa coscienza mitologica e del rapporto fra quello che è il nostro retaggio di racconti che non hanno attinenza con la storia reale, con quella che esplorano gli archeologi e gli storiografi, la persistenza di questi miti che in parte confliggono, in parte convivono con la memoria storica vera e propria, e ci invita a riflettere attraverso il percorso narrativo e storico e religioso dell'identità ebraica in quella consapevolezza mitologica, come la sentirete definire e raccontare da lui, che è non meno fondativa per tutti noi, non solo per il popolo ebraico o per tutto ciò che deriva da quel messaggio biblico che in fondo ci unisce più che mai nelle 3 religioni monoteistiche che prendono le mosse da questo racconto più classico che mai, perché cosa c'è di più persistente e di più strabiliante al tempo stesso delle grandi narrazioni bibliche. Quindi buon ascolto e buona riflessione intorno al racconto di un grandissimo scrittore che è anche un grande osservatore della realtà passata e presente.
Throughout history, the Jewish people has built its national identity mainly on myth, rather than on awareness and contact with actual history, and the time has come for it to urgently confront this issue. I will go so far as to ask if Israel, and here I draw a distinction between Jews in diaspora and Jews in Israel, is at a crossroads, having to decide whether to shape his future national identity on the European model, which is built essentially on the awareness of historical time-place continuity, or on the American model based essentially on the creation and narrating of the national identity according to old and new myth. Perhaps I exaggerate the contradiction between the American or Canadian and the European and Asian, such as the Japanese and Chinese identity models. But it seems that with regard to the Israeli, it is worth clarifying the point for the sake of future clarity rather than in terms of the past. What is myth? What is the meaning of this elusive though vital concept? Roland Barthes, the famous researcher of culture, speaks of myth and mythology as acceptance of the world as it wants to be and not as it is. The word myth derives from the Greek mythos, in the sense of a faculty through condition, as in Homer's writing. The noun denounces great authority and the verb denotes truth-telling. In Greece, according to the Encyclopedia, myth is an attempt to explain the relationship between rationality and philosophical truth, morality and religious belief, a pre-scientific attempt to interpret a certain real or imagined phenomena via the gods' relationship among themselves and with human beings. Or to put it more clearly, human myth, human truth, and not truth itself. The first thing that meets the eyes in this definition is the actual combination of two poles. On the one hand, the pole of supreme truth, which, with great and almost impossible power, integrate elements that cannot blend with one another. And on the other hand, the pole of untruth or subjective imagination, which tries to lend significance and truth to things whose existence cannot be factually or historically proved. It is not the truth, it is not a fact, it's just a myth. We hear ourselves protest against lies and mistaken facts that have acquired undue status. Hence, people argue to explode myth in the belief that by doing so they are serving truth by clearing the air of lies. The myth is a super story hovering above history that is anchored in time and place, trying to express and actualize a deeper, general, timeless truth that, however, had far greater actual relevance than a historic fact that is individuated when it is lifespan ends. Myth is constant and can be shared by different people in different places. The story of Jesus' crucifixion and return to life is not a historical fact that took place in 30 CE. It is a myth that billions of people believe to be at least as real and true as what they read in the newspaper. The sacrifice of Isaac is a mythological story of such great power in Jewish identity consciousness that it had suffered the national and religious consciousness for thousands of years. There is no significance in locating it in a definite historic time or place. Its power is actively alive for Jews living thousands of kilometers from Jerusalem hilltop where it happened. A particularly significant and powerful historical fact may be elevated in the course of time to become a myth. The Holocaust, for example, is not merely another historical event that occurred in a certain place and a certain time, yet it is already ascending to the clouds of mythology. The collective suicides of Jews refusing to convert during the Crusades at the end of the 11th century have already separated from their historic time, place, and circumstances and have become a mythological example. For over 2,000 years in the diaspora, the Jews built their identity mainly on mythological, not historical consciousness. This was primarily due to the fact that the religion was the basic component of their identity. For so many years, religious identity are characterized mainly by mythological and not historical elements. The basis for a national communal life committed to a defined territory with its own language was not real for the Jews. Instead, it was imagined an existence in the metaphors, symbols, and ritual of religion, so that the possibility of establishing exact historic consciousness aligned to real places with precise chronology was weak and minimal in Jewish identity. I will attempt to explain my words with one of many examples. The Jews have mourned the destruction of the first temple by making a special day of fasting on the Hebrew calendar. The fast is observed to this day in Israel. In fact, the fast mourns the destruction of both the first and the second temple. The first temple was destroyed in 580 BC and the second temple in 70 AD or CE. The two historic events are very different from each other and occurred within an interval of almost 600 years between them. The reasons for the destruction were so different and were unique to each period. By joining the two events, the memory ceases to be historical and becomes the mythological memory of the obscure, generalized occurrence. Because the Jews wandered from place to place, and even if they settled for hundreds of years in a place like Poland, they regarded it as temporary, a sort of traditional resistance, until they could return to their true home in the land of Israel. They were not interested in documenting and recording their way of life, or in documenting and investigating the relationship between themselves and the non-Jews among whom they lived, and place and the time were irrelevant. Messiah would come soon and carry them to their original homeland, the real place to which they belong. Time itself would change in the land of Israel. It would become divine time, the time of redemption. It would completely alter their way of life that was now utterly dependent on the mercies of the nations around them. In addition to this, since the Jews were scattered all over the world, it was also impossible, for a practical point of view, to record the histories of the many foreign places in which they lived. How could a Jew live in the Yemen record the lifestyle of a Polish Jew he had never seen and whose reality was inaccessible to him? The only context in which they could meet and develop a sense of belonging was not in the record and memory of a specific history, but solely in the general myth that established their identity. Thus, the Jews endlessly repeating the following passage: in every generation, a man must see himself as having come out of Egypt. Let us say that myth, unlike history, is a living and present thing, and the Jews have to revise their identity according to the myth and not according to the immediate historical context in which they operate. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the existence of mythological consciousness? The seemingly obvious advantage was the Jews could scatter throughout the world among various nations and civilizations and still preserve the kernel of their identity without being too dependent on the local historical conditions and circumstances. In spite of the vast differences in the lifestyle of the different communities, Jews could maintain their unity via their belief in the same, usually religious myth, although this myth developed over time to include generally spiritual myth. What is more, the myth of messianic redemption was a source of hope in hard time of persecution by the host countries. However, the disadvantages of mythological consciousness are far greater than the advantages. In the first place, few could preserve their identity for an extended period by means of mythological consciousness served from a real connection with the real homeland and a framework of commitment to their own people. Thus, over long years of exile, many Jews, there was between 3 and 4 million Jews throughout the ancient world, in the fall to just 1 million. More serious than this, the essence of the myth had become like a monad. It could not be changed or corrected. nor was it open to rational criticism. At best, it could be interpreted. Take it or leave it. It were the only available option. Therefore, Jews that were bound to their mythological consciousness, for example, accepted the hatred of non-Jews as an unalterable decree of fate. On certain level, their mythological identity invited a mythological response, so that the Christians saw their myth of the crucifixion as a complete rejection and denial of the Jewish identity. Their myth, so the response to them were mythological. The mythological identity also did not bring the Jews to juxtapose themselves with other nations in history and did not see their history as part of the world history. They regarded themselves always as hated and essentially other. Thus, along with geographical mobility, social flexibility, and the adaptability of the individual Jew, the Jewish collective remained fixed and petrified within the mythological identity that, together with vision of destruction and ruins, allows them to nourish the passive, vain hope of divine salvation and prevented them from correctly perceiving the terrible danger that threatened them, as proved by the Holocaust. Therefore, when the great Jewish philosopher Gershom Scholem defined Zionism as the Jewish return to history, he meant above all the possibility that the Jews would modify and weaken the mythological element in their identity and strengthen the historical consciousness in a territorial homeland with clear borders, in which there would be a consciousness of time, a sequence of early and late, a consciousness that learned from past mistakes and believes they could be corrected. A consciousness that also learned the history of other, particular neighboring nations for whom it would be possible to learn how to improve, change, and correct itself without damaging the kernel of identity. Nevertheless, although Zionism is over 100 years old, and its achievements in establishing a national identity are many, the struggle between Israeli historical consciousness and Israeli mythological consciousness is far from being resolved. The mythological consciousness is still fortified in Israel by at least 4 different factors. The existence of religious communities throughout the country who preserve the basic codes of the mythological consciousness. In religious seminaries and schools, they still persist in studying religious texts with no bearing on their historical background. Second, the profound connection with the dispersed Jewish communities, whose identity generally continues to exist through the old myth. Third, globalization, which seems to blur national identity and create mobility among new world myths, which Jews can easily combine with their own myth. Four, the symbolic political connection with the USA, whose basic identity inclination is toward myth and not history. Hence, all those among us who want to strengthen the historic consciousness, whereas antibody to regressive religious element, or as reinforcement of the Israeli national consciousness against Jewish diaspora mentality, or as a means for Israel to become a true member of the family of nation, to normalize a national existence that take moral responsibility for its action is not bound to mythological decree of fate. All those who want to do this, whether by research or by art, will do well to adopt the European model as a source of inspiration and study. Thank you.